Hey guys, Mr. Sherwin here. I thought I would take a minute to kind of go over the one big Battlefront assignment that you were given. Normally, we would go over the questions and the answers from your study guide, but I think looking at the actual document itself, there's a lot of quotations from the document I thought were very good. And I've also updated the Canvas module. It talks about artwork that was used in this study, in this exhibit. And it's important for our purposes because we're going to go on the junior field trip in Shreveport in November. And the plan so far is to go to the Norton Art Gallery. And a lot of the artists that were mentioned in the passage that you read are actually, they have artwork, not the same artwork, but they have artwork displayed at the Norton as well. And we're going to do some lecture on early American art. So what you'll see in Canvas now, you'll see examples of some of these artworks. Like here's the Siege of Yorktown. I tried to find an actual page, but the best picture I saw was on the History Channel. Another one, we have the Surrender at Yorktown, which is by Van Blerenberg. Okay, as you can see here, predominantly the battlefield. Not a lot of American present here, mostly just French. Okay, and then finally, Surrender of Lord Cornwallis. Okay, picture there making De Lafayette look like a hero, which he was. Okay, so I thought they were good to actually see. So when you get a chance, kind of look at these. I'm not an art person, maybe you are, but I think the author of the document did a pretty good job of explaining how this helps us understand that we get a myth about the American Revolution, that we were all by ourselves, didn't have the help of foreign allies, and that it was about democracy and preserving life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which we know there are some flaws in that assumption. So I thought we'd look over this. In fact, let's look over the one where I made some annotations, not to read the entire thing, but just read some quotes that I thought were pretty interesting in helping us understanding the worldwide effects of the American Revolution, and how it wasn't really just our revolution. It was really the world changing with regard to the power of England. Okay, so the paragraph here: the roots of this war lay in the global 7 Years' War, known in the United States as the French and Indian War. In that conflict, Britain was able to consolidate its strength, while France and Spain experienced significant losses. At the time of the American Revolution, other European powers were seeking to restrain Great Britain, the greatest world power and owner of the planet's most threatening navy. It's a great teaser because what it does, it sets up the idea that the American Revolution was our help that we gained from France and other nations was not really pro-America. It wasn't to help America. It was more so to hurt the British and to restrain their power. Okay. So another sentence I found was very good. In a global context, the American Revolution was largely a war about trade and economic influence, not ideology. France and Spain, like Britain, were monarchies with even less fondness for democracy. So the idea that our revolution was about democracy, for us, that might be the case. But the reason we won was foreign influence, especially France. And it's interesting to think about that they're helping themselves. They're about economic gain, not helping us create some form of democracy. So that's a myth that can be dispelled. Okay. Other interesting lines. To the French, Spanish, and Dutch governments, this was not a war about liberty. It was about power and profit. If American colonists won their independence, that would cause harm to British interest and open new trade opportunities in North America and elsewhere for those allied themselves with the colonists. So it's about taking away trade opportunities from the British, who pretty much had a monopoly in their own colonies. So that's the reason that the author says that the French and the Dutch really, and the Spanish, helped the American colonists, not necessarily for democracy, but for their own economic gain, which, as we know, is the primary reason we go to war in the first place, economic gain. Okay, so some of the artists that were mentioned in here, Trumbull, Peale, those are ones we'll talk about when we get into the early American art unit. I thought it was very interesting, this paragraph here that talks about how England is predisposed with wars all over the world. Okay, and how if we look at the date range, the last battle of the American Revolution really wasn't Yorktown. It was not in Virginia. It was actually in India. That's when the British stopped fighting. Okay, they were focused on maintaining their colonial influence in India because they clearly saw that what they were fighting to maintain in America wasn't working. Okay, I think this paragraph on page 2 is a great paragraph that explains the sort of global impact that the American Revolution will have with these world powers. After all fighting ended, Britain negotiated separate peace treaties with the United States, France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic in 1783. While Britain maintained its dominant position on the high seas, the treaties gave the American colonies their independence, returned French prestige lost in the Seven Years' War, guaranteed Spain's holdings in the Americas as well as its trade routes, and left the Dutch Republic in a worse position in both trade and world power. So power doesn't get created or destroyed like matter. It essentially gets moved around. So the English lose power, that goes to the French and the Spanish. The Dutch attempt to help us in the war, and they're just not much of a power, and they end up weakening themselves in an attempt to gain some economic power. Okay, so it goes to talk about the different displays and artists and things like that. We're going to skip that part, and we're going to look at this part here. So the last two paragraphs of this document, I think, are really good at explaining why it's important for us to look at the global context of the American Revolution. American leaders of the 18th century understood the international context of their revolution. As John Adams wrote in 1784, a complete history of the American War is nearly the history of mankind for the whole epoch of it. The history of France, Spain, Holland, England, and the neutral powers, as well as America, are at least comprised in it. However, over the course of the 19th century, American histories of the Revolution minimalized the Allies' role, building a nationalistic myth of raw courage and self-sufficiency that represented an early glimpse of American exceptionalism. And I'm going to pause there for just a moment. We're going to talk about history. We talked about ideological distortion of history, how we are sort of led down a path where the author of history wants us to go because they're passionate about it, and we kind of gloss over a lot of the truths that are also part of history that we don't want to talk about. I'll go back to Columbus and Patriots history, people's history, how we got to hear two sides of the story with regard to early exploration in the New World. Okay, American exceptionalism is the idea that America has sort of created its own form of government, and so we're somehow special. And that idea of us being special is going to cause problems when we branch out and deal with other groups, other ethnic groups, other racial groups. And so we'll hear about this throughout history, how America justifies its actions because of the fact that we're special and created democracy and fought a whole war for liberty. But if you look at the American Revolution in the global context and who helped us and why they helped us and how we won the war itself was not just about liberties and freedoms, it was about economic gains. And so when we look at that, we can also kind of see some of the flaws in this myth of American exceptionalism. Okay. Over the last century, awareness of the multifaceted war has become more widely shared by scholars of that period. Nevertheless, while Lafayette never totally faded from history, the much larger global war that determined American independence seldom finds its way into popular histories and textbooks. We Americans are too narrow-minded in how we view our national history, as if we alone have determined our own identity or destiny. Yet this has never been true, says Allison. Our nation was formed from colonies of other nations, and the native peoples that they encountered in North America. The revolution that gave us independence was, in fact, a world war, and battles fought elsewhere determined the outcome as much as what happened in North America. Without allies, the colonies would never have gained their freedom. Since then, development and prosperity have always been shaped by our relations with other countries, as they continue to be today. American history, without the perspective of its international context, leads us to false and dangerous perceptions of who we really are. So that's what I wanted to cover. Thank you guys so much for listening.